Period comes to life in landmarks.
In November 1992, the Queen's great palace at Windsor Castle caught fire. For several hours, the ancient buildings blazed. The fire at Windsor Castle and the question of who should pay for the damage rekindled a debate about the monarchy in Great Britain. We asked some Windsor children for their views about the Queen and the rest of the royal family. Do we still need them?
I think it's a good idea to have the Queen because she's someone that people can look up to. I don't see why we should get rid of them because they've been there for years and years and years.
What have you escaped just now? What councils have you escaped?
I think that if the monarchy are to stay, they should give a good impression. So far from the media, we've heard about the marriages in the royal family that they have been breaking up. I don't think a lot of people look up to the monarchy now because of all these breakages.
Certainly the newspapers are full of stories about the royal family, and people's interest in them is tremendous. Wherever they go, the television cameras follow. But why do we still have a Queen? Why do we have palaces and processions and golden coaches? What in fact does the Queen do? We asked historian Dr. David Starkey.
This is the King Henry VIII Gate of Windsor Castle. For over 800 years, the ancestors of Queen Elizabeth II have lived here. But most of those ancestors were very different sorts of monarch from our present Queen. Our present Queen is a ceremonial monarch. She troops the colour. She rides in processions. She opens hospitals and schools. What she does not do is rule. She has got generals to command her armies. She's got civil servants to run the country. And of course, she does not control the generals or the civil servants. That job is done by the Prime Minister.
I told the House that the Queen had asked me to consider the basis upon which she might voluntarily pay tax on her personal income and also take responsibility for certain payments under the current civil list arrangements. Madam Speaker, I'm confident that the House will welcome these initiatives by the Queen and the Prince of Wales.
The Prime Minister, in theory, is her first servant. Actually, he's the leader of the party that gets the largest majority in a parliament. Earlier monarchs, however, had to be ceremonial monarchs. They also had to be their own prime ministers and sometimes their generals and their civil servants too.
In this series of programs, we're going to travel back in time to the 16th and 17th centuries to meet some of the kings and queens who owned Windsor Castle in the past and who once ruled this country. The Tudors and Stuarts. It is early morning on August the 22nd in the year 1485. Deep in the Leicestershire countryside, armed men prepare for a battle which will end a war and change the course of English history. For 30 years, the Plantagenets, the royal family of England, had been torn apart in a fierce struggle over which branch of the family should provide the king. Should it be the House of York, whose badge is the white rose? Or should it be the House of Lancaster, whose badge is the red rose? The Wars of the Roses is a family quarrel on a big scale. 10 times the opposing armies of York and Lancaster met in pitched battle. On Bosworth Field, they were to meet for the last time. Leading one army is the Yorkist king, Richard III. On his battle standard flutters his personal badge, the silver boar. Leading the other army, the Lancastrian Duke of Richmond, who believes he should be king. He is a Welshman, and on his flag is the red dragon. His name is Henry Tudor. Today, more than 500 years later, you can visit the battlefield. Flags mark the positions of the armies at the start of the fight. Once a year, around the anniversary, people dress up and reenact the battle close to the spot where it all happened. Reenacting this battle is nothing new.
Remember whom you are to cope with all.
100 years after the event, William Shakespeare wrote a play about King Richard III, which ends with the Battle of Bosworth.
Whom their outcloyed country vomits forth to desperate adventures and assured destruction. You, sleeping safe, they bring to you unrest.
In this scene, King Richard encourages his men by describing his rival as a weak and feeble man who will be easy to defeat.
And who doth lead them but a paltry fellow? A milksop! One that never in his life felt so much cold as overshoes in snow.
In the next scene, we find out what Henry thinks about King Richard.
Truly, gentlemen, a bloody tyrant and a homicide. A base, foul stone, made precious by the foil of England's chair, where he is falsely set. One that hath ever been God's enemy.
In his play, Shakespeare presents Richard as a man who will do anything to gain power and keep it. He cheats, he lies, he even murders his own young nephews in the Tower of London. Back at Bosworth, the reenactment reaches its climax. From his lookout position on the hill, Richard catches sight of Henry Tudor. This is his chance. If he can kill the upstart rebel, the battle will be as good as over. The plan nearly works. Richard gets within yards of Henry Tudor before he is surrounded and dragged from his horse. Shakespeare's play also reaches its climax. Richard finally meets the man he has been hunting. Henry Tudor, Duke of Richmond.
God in your arms be praised, victorious friends. The day is ours. The bloody dog is dead.
Today, the spot where Richard fell is marked by this stone. Some people believe that Shakespeare didn't describe Richard at all fairly. He was not nearly as evil as the play makes out. Every year, on the anniversary of Richard's death, they put roses by his stone. White roses. In his play, Shakespeare refers to a story in which, after the battle, Richard's crown is found in a thorn bush and brought to Henry Tudor.
Courageous Richmond, well hast thou quit thee. Lo, here this long usurped royalty. Wear it, enjoy it, and make much of it.
Great God of heaven, say amen to all.
The Battle of Bosworth is one of the most famous events in English history, and the date, 1485, is one that we all remember. But we actually know very little about what happened in the battle itself. No TV crews were there, no newspaper reporters, and the contemporary accounts are very poor. So whether Richard III really cried, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, as Shakespeare makes him do, is anybody's guess. What is not a matter of guesswork, however, are the results of the battle. Richard was killed. So were most of the important members of Richard's army. That gave Henry a clean sweep. Even better, not too many important people supported Henry. That meant that he didn't have to reward them. Instead, he was fought for by a close-knit band of supporters that were to be the bedrock of his rule.
This is Westminster Abbey in London. This is where almost every English king and queen has been crowned since William the Conqueror, more than 900 years ago. This is where Queen Elizabeth II was crowned just over 40 years ago. And here, on October the 30th, 1485, Henry VII was crowned King of England, Ireland, and France. Two months later, he was back at the Abbey for his wedding to Elizabeth of York. Thus, the Red Rose of Lancaster was united with the White Rose of York to produce the Tudor Rose, the badge of a new dynasty. This is the museum at Westminster Abbey. It's housed in the Undercroft, one of the oldest parts of the building. Here we can meet King Henry and his bride. Dr. Richard Mortimer, the museum curator, explains.
These heads were made for the funeral effigies of Queen Elizabeth of York and King Henry VII. The effigy is a mock-up of the dead king or queen's body, the same size as the king or queen, and wearing his and her own clothes. The head of Henry VII is made from a death mask, which means that the dead king's face had quantities of wax pressed up against it so that it took an impression of the king's head, just his face and part of his throat and his ears. That was then filled with plaster so that it produced a replica of the king's head. And it's that we have here. We have the front part of his face.
So what sort of country had Henry Tudor conquered? The population was very small compared with today, with less than 3 million people as against 55 million now. London was by far the largest city. 60,000 people lived and worked there. This was the centre of government, business and trade. But most people lived and worked in the countryside, growing crops and raising animals. Much of the land was owned and controlled by great noblemen. Men like the Duke of Buckingham, who lived here at Penshurst in Kent, or the Earl of Oxford, who lived here at Hedingham Castle in Essex. Yet more land was held by the monasteries, like the one at Glastonbury in Somerset. Sheep farming and weaving wool into cloth had made many people very rich indeed. You can see how rich they were because of the wonderful churches they built with their profits. Henry Tudor's England is a very religious Roman Catholic country, but it's also a very wealthy one. Wealthy enough for some men to dream of taking it from him. Henry was well aware he had gained his throne on the battlefield. He could easily lose it the same way. To survive, he needed to do three things: to increase his wealth, to reduce the power of the great nobles, and to provide a son to rule after him. Over the next 18 years, Elizabeth gave Henry 8 children in all. 4 died at birth or shortly after. We can plot the ones who survived on a family tree. Arthur, the Prince of Wales, his sister Margaret, Henry, the Duke of York, and his sister Mary. As soon as the children were born, Henry began making plans for their future. The girls would be married to foreign kings to help strengthen Henry's support abroad. Arthur was betrothed to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. In 1501, when Arthur was 15 and Catherine was just 17, the two were married with great splendor. And what of the 10-year-old Prince Henry, the Duke of York? No marriage plans were made for him, as his father intended he would become the Archbishop of Canterbury. Previous kings had depended on the support of powerful nobles. Henry was determined that this would not happen to him. Together with a group of clever lawyers, Henry began taxing and fining the noblemen. He fined one of his great supporters, the Earl of Oxford, £10,000 for running a private army. The young Duke of Buckingham, who lived at Penshurst Place, was made to pay thousands of pounds for the king's protection. Henry himself checked the accounts each day and signed that they were correct. While many noblemen got poorer and poorer, the king grew increasingly wealthy. And of course, money gives you power. In 1503, a series of tragedies struck King Henry. From Ludlow Castle came news that his eldest son Arthur, the Prince of Wales, had died suddenly. Henry was heartbroken. The following year, his wife Elizabeth also died. She was only 38. Henry grew more and more isolated and lonely. He was suspicious that his courtiers were plotting against him. He trusted nobody. People in turn feared him. His eyesight began to fail.
We think of Henry Tudor as a cold fish, and yet he broke down and cried when his eldest son died. We also think of him as a chartered accountant king who spends all his day with figures, and yet he won a battle and kept the throne as a soldier. But above all, Henry VII was a bit of a gangster. He squeezed money out of people. He ran protection rackets. He kept his bully boys in the localities wearing their livery of green and white, and he eliminated rivals. And that was why he was able to do what no one had been able to do for 100 years and hand his throne over safely to his son, Henry VIII.
The young King Henry set about completing the magnificent new chapel which his father had built on the east end of Westminster Abbey. The chapel would contain his parents' tomb, which would lie close to the tombs of other great kings of England. In his will, Henry VII had left detailed instructions. The tomb would be surrounded by a bronze grille and decorated with the badges of his reign. Dragons, roses, and a crown surrounded by thorns. On the tomb itself, the canvas and plaster effigies would be replaced by bronze figures of himself and his wife. And above him on the walls, carved in stone, angels and archangels, prophets and philosophers, saints and holy men and women, and all the company of heaven. So why did Henry want such an incredible resting place with monks contracted to sing for his soul until the end of time? To glorify his family name and show all the world that even after the king has died, the Tudors live on.
Most extraordinary